Hello all. Your master of lore is here once again to unearth the secrets long since buried beneath the sands of Kenshi. This time, however, I have chosen to turn my attention towards a particular group of anthropophagists who have since darkened the doors of any denizens dwelling within the darker regions of the north. A group of devolved and degenerate demons who have spent more than a millennia partaking in horrific and grotesque acts of violence and carnage. I am of course referring to the groups of cannibals, or the painted tribe as the locals have come to call them, that have resided in the northwest of Kenshi since the Second Empire, although, if my findings are to be believed, their origins date back to that of the ancient First Empire, and the massive machine factories that were created to swell their numbers. So sit back, dear viewers, as I break down not only the hierarchy, motivations, and biology of the painted tribe, but also dive directly into the gruesome and toxic origins behind their de-evolution from the Second Empire citizens they once were to the grotesque and malformed nightmare fuel they are today. This is the origins of the cannibals. Throughout the cannibal plains, there is examples of entire settlements having been seemingly abandoned all at once. Food still sitting on the tables, lights still on, valuables still present, and no signs of any visible struggle. A veritable gold mine for a drifter in need of respite and resupply. And yet, if a weary traveler were to rest their heads in these ghost towns, drifting off to sleep in these abandoned beds, dreaming of tomorrow's fortunes, they would soon come face to face with the grisly truth behind the sudden disappearances of the inhabitants, as well as all of those responsible. They roam the same rainy landscapes they have for well over 1,000 years, hunting those unlucky enough to find themselves in their path, swarming them with vast numbers and beating them until fighting back is no longer an option, as well as abducting men, women, and children from their beds, only to carry the bodies of the victims from their assault back to their depraved villages. There they are thrown in cages of iron, skin, and bone, forced to watch as one by one they are beaten and slaughtered before having their bodies dragged over and mounted on spigots, roasting over an open flame and devoured, piece by piece, in clear view to those who have yet to meet the same grisly fate. A truly horrifying and nightmare-inducing experience that has left irreparable scars on the neighboring region's inhabitants. But who are these monstrous beings? Where did they come from? And what could drive them to turn to such extremes? To understand the origins behind the painted tribe, we must first examine them in the modern day. The cannibals are a bipedal group of humanoids residing in the northern region of Kenshi, painted from head to toe in ritualistic series of reds, whites, yellows, greens, and blacks, as well as suffering from numerous physical abnormalities ranging from extended and bloated midsections, large and imposingly disproportionate features, as well as underdeveloped hunchbacks. They exist in a tribal society comprised of smaller hunchbacks acting as field medics and disposable infantry, and of more upright and bloated humanoids filling the roles in the middle and upper tiers of their hierarchy. Theirs is a culture where the strong survive, and the weak are merely devoured to fuel their hunt for the next meal. Indeed, it appears that their entire society is based solely on the locating, retrieving, and consumption of flesh, so much so that even as the centuries have gone on, and the denizens of Kenshi have become more and more wary of traveling through their regions, they have persisted still by hunting and feasting on each other to survive. But could their obsession with meat be even more than just one of nourishment? Upon entering their horrifying villages, you'll notice they are filled with dozens and dozens of totems and effigies, adorned with bones and the remains of their victims. Could these be purely decorative attempts to scare and subdue their prey? Or quite possibly in reverence to some unknown god or religious beliefs? Or even more so, as we will come to propose, a twisted and malformed version of a religion that we already are very familiar with. To further dissect the religious implications, we look at the distinct differences between the genders of cannibals. Aside from the obvious anatomical differences, the cannibals are differentiated by the pattern of war paint and tribal markings that they display. The males wear darker paints with multiple colors around their legs and ribcage-like bone markings on their upper torso, a fitting look for such a grotesque existence. However, where things become interesting is when we examine the females' paint. Theirs is done in a full, singular color pattern, with an emblem on their stomach that upon closer inspection looks somewhat suspiciously similar to that of the holy nations. The only notable difference being the presence of 5 diamonds instead of the 3 traditionally seen today in images of the holy flame. This connection may initially seem superficial and arbitrary, perhaps just a coincidental design choice by the developers, but upon seeing the leader of the cannibal tribes, the insinuation that the cannibals are in some fashion related to the Okranite religion becomes even more convincing. Named as the Cannibal Grand Wizard, this singular man acts as the vile leader of the cannibal tribes located on Kenshi, ruling from a ruined city of Dead Cat, aptly renamed as the Cannibal Capital. He stands adorned with Holy Nation armor and a pariah of cannibal chiefs at his defense. To tie this back to my belief of the connection between cannibal culture and the Holy Nation's religion, not only is his armor that of the Holy Nation, but his very title is consistent with the vernacular nomenclature associated with the Holy Nation itself, comprised of medieval and typically European concepts such as paladins, phoenixes, inquisitors, and sentinels. And the idea of a grand wizard continues to lend to the common thoughts evoked by this feudal European theme often seen in the Holy Nation. This connection is given even more credibility by Kenshi's consistent use of connected and thematic references to real-world civilizations. The Holy Nation is very reminiscent of feudal Europe during the Dark Ages of scientific oppression and its strict religious doctrines, an emphasis on farming and agriculture, and its militaristic hierarchy in which loyal knights and soldiers were given favor and privilege over the common folk, as well as a singular king and leader being appointed by divine birthright. This ultimately culminates in the Crusades, which are akin to the current battles occurring in the region of Bast, where the nobility of the UC was burned at the stake and a bloody conflict of ideology is occurring between the two bodies. This trend continues with the United Cities, whose nomenclature, hierarchy, and current socioeconomic situation is based largely on the 700-year period of feudal Japan, in which the emperor was acting as a figurehead with no real power compared to that of the daimyos, who controlled their individual domains without checks or restrictions, often to the detriment and abuse of its people. Even the current peasant revolts on Kenshi are similar to the numerous large-scale civil unrest of the same period in Japanese history. And as a final example, the Second Empire has its own hierarchy of an emperor, advisors, and uses nomenclature in terms such as auxiliaries and legionaries to name their military forces. And its slow internal decline is in fact a direct parallel to the fall of Rome, in which the empire slowly fell apart from the inside due to internal corruption, abuse of its citizens, overexpansion causing shortages and administrative division, and repeated conflicts between the Roman legion and Germanic tribes to the north and west, all while Christianity was spreading internally, paralleling the cannibal tribes' conflict to the north, and the conflict between the cult of Stobe internally, which would later become the Holy Nation, which, as we discussed, is also a nation based on Dark Age Christianity. To further drive the point home, during the earlier days of the Roman Empire, they would frequently use propaganda against the Christians and later Germanic invaders to paint them as barbaric monsters. One such tactic was labeling them as cannibals, who partook in incest and blood rituals. An oddly similar comparison to the foe that we face today on Kenshi, and given the real-world parallels I have pointed out thus far, it suddenly starts to paint an interesting picture in which the cannibals are representative of a propagandized version of the Christian and Germanic adversaries of the Roman Empire. Maybe I'm just putting on my tinfoil hat here, but the consistent use of real-world themes, historical references, and hierarchical nomenclature across all of Kenshi is something that should be examined when piecing together the possible origins of these violent marauders. The entire point of this comparison is to show that the evidence of similar themes in the cannibal leader's title and the Holy Nation ranks as well as the emblem shown on the female cannibal's stomach being similar to that of the Holy Nations, is likely a deliberate choice rather than arbitrary and coincidental design. So returning back to the history of Kenshi's cannibals, we should next go through the things we know about the cannibals in order to begin to glimpse into the possible origins of these meat maniacs. According to skeleton characters entering the cannibal plains, they are largely unaware of what could have caused northwestern denizens of Kenshi to develop a taste for human meat. But possible reasoning is later proposed by Finch of the Tech Hunters. Their degeneration could be put down to toxic environmental factors, which they were unable to adapt to, damaging substances from their own labs, induced madness from experiments gone wrong, or simply being reduced to cannibalism due to severe famine. Of the three ideas that Finch proposes, I am of the mindset it was the first that led to the evident mental degeneration of the northwestern humans. As we know, the landscape of Kenshi once had water levels much higher than they are today, and I have reason to believe, which I will explain momentarily, that they were also, prior to the collapse of the First Empire, much lower and similar to what they are today. You see in front of you is a map made originally by Reddit user Silberner Flugel, and then further expanded upon by myself. Using the landscape's natural topography and indicators of water erosion in the surface of modern Kenshi, we were able to fill in the areas that were likely once completely submerged. However, in many of the areas that were known to be submerged, we also find First Empire ruins, whereas Second Empire ruins only ever sit on the coastlines of these waterlogged landscapes. So we can reasonably assume the water levels were quite similar to where they are now prior to the fall of the First Empire, rose before the Second, and then fell again within the last 1,000 years. The most likely explanation for this is that the water levels rose due to a decrease in atmospheric temperatures from a possible nuclear winter or greenhouse pollution during the Age of Chaos. However, as the temperatures began to correct themselves, the newly formed ice and snow began to melt, raising water levels to their state during the Second Empire, and over the next several centuries, the temperatures would again return to their pre-Age of Chaos levels, leading to the water level dropping back down. This is important because one such area that would have been submerged was the floodlands, an area that once housed massive production facilities dedicated to the creation of skeletons, and who knows what other technological marvels. And with those massive means of production, one could only begin to fathom the types of complex chemicals and heavy metals being used there. Chemicals and metals that were now submerged underwater for an extended period of time. They could have easily began to seep into the surrounding landscapes. And what would happen if one such landscape happened to not only be the only fertile land in the immediate vicinity, but a significantly fertile one at that? Why would an empire of skeletons who lack a full understanding of the human condition even think twice about using that land to house some of its human citizens? Humans who would then use that land to farm for crops and food, and one can only imagine what might happen to the crops that would be grown there, or the poor people who consume them. Succumbing to the effects of heavy metal poisoning and other toxic ailments from consuming tainted crops could easily lead to increased aggression, delirium, and a degeneration of mental faculties and moral understanding. This, paired with the aforementioned religious beliefs of a likely present and growing cult of Stobe in the area, could easily have devolved them from a once oppressed religious order to one of blood rituals and human sacrifices in the name of their god, and then further to ritualistic cannibalism, and then finally culminating in a complete abandonment of civil and moral society, obsessed with a primitive urge to seek and devour any meat they can find. And as generations went on, this continued consumption of human flesh would lead to further neurodegeneration, resulting in the cannibal tribes that we see today. Well, ironically, the prolonged exposure to these chemical-ridden lands, while destroying their mind, would also contribute to the cannibals' innate acid immunity. So, dear viewers, now that we have examined the various aspects that we know of these depraved degenerates of death and defilement and pondered several questions regarding them, we can start to put together a picture of the origins behind the northern cannibals. So sit back and allow me to spin you a tale of faith and hope, turned into desolation and depravity that would span for well over 1,000 years. During the Second Empire, Catlan, the mightiest and most noble of the skeletons, had devoted himself to the preservation of humans in the name of redemption for the skeletons' past sins. He searched through the vast lands of Kenshi for fertile areas to settle the humans in, where they could sow crops and flourish under the protective eye of his empire. One such area lied to the north of the Floodlands, the area of the skeletons' birth, and so he built a settlement and outposts in the area, and fields for them to sow and grow their own food on the base of the lake that is now the Floodlands. However, as the skeletons lack an understanding of the human condition, evolution, and their propensity for illness, it never occurred to them that the toxic metals and chemicals residing in the water just south of this fertile land could have easily tainted the very landscape itself. At first, things were fine. The land was fertile, and the people were fed and happy. But as time went on, the skeletons became more and more oppressive, putting more and more pressure on the humans. It was at this time that the cult of Stowe began to truly gain traction and began to morph into the current variation of the Holy Nation's religion that we know today, with its dogmatic beliefs in favor of human superiority and the rejection of skeleton rule. This, paired with the continued consumption of tainted crops and water, caused a slow degeneration of the mental faculties in the humans of the North. However, by the time they realized what was happening, it was far too late. Their intelligence had been degraded too far, and they began to show signs of increased aggression and a decrease in reasoning, especially in the oppressed and downtrodden members of the cult of Stowe. With their decreased mental state and their increase in aggression, the cult began making blood and ritualistic sacrifices in order to appease their now malformed and twisted god, begging for salvation and the strength for the humans to rise up against their skeleton oppressors. This would further escalate as farming had begun to halt as people degenerated into a state of being incapable of sowing the fields. The blood sacrifices and rituals would become ritualistic cannibalism in the name of hunger and hate, in which they would devour the strength of the other humans to bolster their own against the inedible ones. All of this while maintaining a very faint grip on their religious origins. The skeletons would attempt to hold them at bay, taking a purely defensive position on the borders and containing the cannibal threat to the north, all while not fully understanding what could have caused them to devolve to such a degree. However, this would only further complicate the problem, as now restricting the population would lead to generations upon generations of inbreeding, as well as continued consumption of human flesh, leading to an even further degradation both physically and mentally, until after over 1,000 years we were left with the disproportionate and malformed barbaric cannibals we see today. But what of those who were not active members of the cult? What of those who resisted the call to cannibalism? Well, conveniently, there happens to be an additional faction of malformed and mentally degraded individuals near the cannibal plains that also happen to not partake in the cannibalism. These would be known as the Shrieking Bandits. You see, it's likely that when the cult turned violent, the less aggressive humans who rejected the ideas were captured and devoured for their rituals. Those who escaped attempted to flee inland towards the Empire's capital, but were halted by General Zhang and his men as they were unable to discern the cannibals from the rest of the populace, just as they were later unable to discern pirates from their own civilians, and instead chose to effectively blockade them out from the greater empire in a purely defensive position, forcing them to flee outward to the surrounding regions instead, where they remained for 1,000 years, although their rate of decline has visibly decreased, likely due to a decrease in exposure to the chemicals and toxins of the cannibal plains. These individuals now roam the area immediately surrounding the cannibal plains, and are recognized by their cacophony of unintelligible screeches and rees, likely a lasting effect of the mental decline from generations prior. And while they can in fact be violent and aggressive towards outsiders, they're also capable of peaceful interactions, as noted by one of the tech hunters' journals describing them as simply being misunderstood nomads. And there you have it, dear viewers, the full and concise story documenting the most likely origins of the cannibals on Kenshi. And while we may never know the truth about what caused these humans to fall into such levels of depravity, one thing is certain: one should always sleep with one eye open, for you never know what could be waiting just over the horizon to make you its next meal.